They were very cumbersome things at first, terrific caterpillar wheels, And what they were very good, of course, that they were able to get across the trench, you see, without... and they'd crush the wires, you see. They did work that the artillery couldn't do. Very often our men attacked the German front line and found the wire hadn't been cut by our own artillery. But as soon as the tanks came along, of course, they simply crushed the wires, you see. And even these machine guns, you see, because the infantry used to follow just behind the tank. There was usually a little party of infantrymen following the tank. But I think they frightened the life out of Jerry when he first saw them.
Picture a strip of churned French farmland just before dawn on the 15th of September 1916. You're a German infantryman. You've been here for weeks. You know this ground the way you know the back of your own hand. Every shell hole, every snapped tree, every smell. You've survived the Somme so far, which by 1916 in September is its own kind of grim accomplishment. Because the Somme has been swallowing men by the tens of thousands since the 1st of July. You've learned the rhythm of it. The barrage lifts, you scramble up to your fire step. The British come walking across no man's land into your machine guns, and you do the terrible arithmetic that the machine gun makes possible. That's the war you understand. That's the war everyone understands by the autumn of 1916. It is a war of mud and wire and the relentless mathematics of the modern weapon. And then, in the gray half-light, you hear something you have never heard before. Not the whistle of a shell, not the crack of a rifle. It's a grinding, a clanking, a deep mechanical growl coming out of the smoke towards your trench. Slow, patient, unhurried, which is somehow the worst part. And then you see it. A great steel rhomboid the size of a small house, heaving itself over the broken ground on tracks that chew the earth, swatting your barbed wire aside like it's cobwebs, taking your machine gun fire, your machine gun fire, the thing that has ruled this battlefield for 2 years, and shrugging it off like rain. What do you even call that? The men who built it didn't have a good word for it either, so they'd given it a code name, a deliberately boring one, a lie, meant to keep it secret. They called it a tank. And the place where it first crawled into history, that little smashed Picardy village just up the road, the one the Canadians would take that very same day, was called Courcelette. This is the story of the tank on the Western Front, how a desperate idea became a clanking, broken down, terrifying reality. How it failed and failed again, and then, almost when nobody was looking, worked. And it's a story that runs straight through the Canadian Corps because Canadians were there at the very first hour of it. And Canadians were there at the hour it finally came of age. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with the problem the tank was born to solve, because like anything else, you can't understand this machine until you understand the nightmare it was invented to break. Welcome to the 30th episode of Memory and Valour, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the sacrifices of soldiers and veterans of the First World War. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae. Thanks again for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. As you've guessed it, today's story is all about the tanks on the Western Front. Specifically, the first time they appeared, which would be at the village of Courcelette on the 15th of September, 1916. And I want to preface this whole entire episode by saying that my great-grandmother's brother, one of her brothers, was named Harland Pemble Smith. And the family grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Harland went to war in the First World War. He was with the 46th Battalion, and he was there the day the tanks rolled across the Western Front on 15 September 1916. Now, Harland survived the war. He had a shrapnel wound to the thigh that never quite healed properly, so he eventually was sent home as unfit in, I think it was mid-1918, if memory serves. Of course, I never got to meet Harland because he was born in, I think it was 1895. Harland would be wounded with that piece of shrapnel to the thigh on the 8th of October, 1916, in the Courcelette area. So he most certainly would have been fighting alongside or very likely behind these tanks as they roamed the Western Front. He would have been part of the infantry that ran behind them. So, interesting little personal note I had to throw in there. So now, on with the show. Okay, here's the thing about the First World War that's genuinely hard to get your head around, even now after all the books and all the documentaries. By 1915, the smartest soldiers in the world had run into a wall and they couldn't figure out how to get over it. I don't mean that as a slight on them. I mean it almost literally. The technology of defense had, in the space of a single generation, sprinted miles ahead of the technology of attack, and nobody had quite noticed until the bodies started piling up. Think about what a defender could do by 1915. He had the magazine rifle, which was accurate, fast, and deadly to hundreds of meters. He had the machine gun, which is the real villain of this piece. One weapon, 2 or 3 men, and a beaten zone of fire that could scythe down an entire advancing battalion in minutes. He had barbed wire, strung in belts dozens of meters deep, designed not so much to stop you as to hold you, to keep you standing in the open just long enough for the machine guns to finish their work. Gruesome. He had artillery, ranged and registered, ready to drop a curtain of high explosive and shrapnel onto any patch of ground he chose. And he had the trench itself, a deep dug-in, sandbagged, wired, machine gun-studded scar across the face of Europe that by the end of 1914 ran more or less unbroken from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Roughly 700 kilometers of it. No flanks, nowhere to go around. The only way was through. Now think about what the attacker had. He had men, he had courage, he had artillery of his own, sure. And then he had his own 2 feet, walking him across a few hundred meters of open ground into the teeth of all of that. It was, to put it plainly, a slaughter. And the generals knew it was a slaughter. This is the part people get wrong, I think. The lazy cliche of the donkey general who simply didn't care, and there's this reference and a book by the same name of lions being led by donkeys. The honest historians, and Tim Cook is very good on this, push back hard on that caricature. These men were not stupid and they were not indifferent. They were facing a genuinely new and genuinely insoluble tactical problem, and they were throwing every solution they had at it, one after another, and watching every one of them fail. More artillery? They tried that. Bigger and bigger bombardments until the preliminary barrage before the Somme threw something like 1.5 million shells at the German lines over a week. Didn't work the way they had hoped. The wire wasn't cut, the deep dugouts held. The defenders came up and manned their guns, and the slaughter happened anyway. Gas? They tried that too. Both sides did. And it was horrific, and it was unreliable, and the wind had a vote. Surprise, cunning, night attacks, feints, all of it. And still the front barely moved. The Somme, that whole vast bloodletting, advanced the line a handful of kilometers at a cost that's almost obscene to write down. So here's the intellectual problem, and I want you to sit in it with me for a second because the people at the time had to sit in it for years. How do you cross a few hundred meters of open, fire-swept ground, get through the wire and get across the trenches, and survive long enough to actually do something on the other side? You need 3 things when you really strip it down. You need protection, something that can take a bullet and keep moving. You need mobility, something that can cross broken, cratered, wire-laced ground that would stop a wheel dead. And you need firepower, something that can hit back once it gets there. So protection, mobility, firepower. Hold on to those 3 words because they're the DNA of every tank ever built, right down to the ones rolling around today. And in 1915, a small group of stubborn, slightly eccentric British men sat down and asked, What if we put all three of those things inside one machine? What if we built a land battleship? I love this part of the story, honestly, because it's where the war gets weird in the best way. We tend to remember the First World War as relentlessly bleak, and it was, but it was also a moment of frantic, almost feverish invention. People were trying everything, and the tank comes out of exactly that culture. A handful of inventors, soldiers, and a famously restless politician, all chasing the same impossible idea from different directions. The politician was Winston Churchill. In 1915, he's First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Navy, which is the first clue to one of the great oddities here. The Army wasn't especially interested at first. It was the Navy, of all institutions, that took the early lead because Churchill set up a body with one of the great names of the war, the Landship Committee. Landships, battleships for the land. You can hear the whole concept right there in the word. And there were soldiers thinking along parallel lines. The one who tends to get the credit, and it's contested like everything in this story, is an officer named Ernest Swinton. Swinton had been out at the front early. He'd seen the deadlock up close, and he'd had the idea of an armored, tracked, gun-carrying machine that could crush wire and cross trenches. He pushed it. He wrote about it, and many people pushed versions of it. That's usually how invention actually works. Lots of hands, and you should be a little suspicious of any one genius story. But Swinton's a name worth keeping. Then you need the engineers, the people who actually have to make a 30-ton steel box move. And here's where it gets practical. The key piece of technology, the thing that makes the whole concept possible, is the continuous track, the caterpillar track. Instead of wheels which sink and bog and snap, you lay your own road in front of yourself, link by link, and roll across it. American agricultural tractors had been using versions of this to cross soft farmland. The leap was to ask, if it can cross a muddy field, can it cross no man's land? The men who turned that question into bolted steel were a firm in Lincoln, Foster's, and two engineers in particular, William Triton and Walter Wilson. And their first attempt in the summer of 1915 was a stubby little prototype that got a wonderfully dismissive nickname, Little Willie. Little Willie could move. He could carry weight. But Little Willie couldn't quite do one thing that mattered most. It couldn't reliably climb out of and across a wide German trench. So they went back and rethought the whole shape. And what they came up with was the silhouette you've got in your head right now when you picture a First World War tank. That great lozenge, that rhomboid with tracks running all the way around the outside of the hull, up and over the top. That shape isn't a style choice, it's pure functionality. The huge wheelless track running right up around that tall sloping nose meant the machine could rear up, get its track onto the far lip of a trench, and haul its own weight across a gap of several meters. The prototype was nicknamed Mother, or sometimes Big Willie. And Mother is, in a real sense, the ancestor of every tank that came after. Now, why tank? This is the bit everyone loves, and it's true. The whole project was wrapped in obsessive secrecy. They needed a cover story for these enormous steel hulls being shipped around the country in crates. So they put it about that the things were mobile water containers, water tanks, bound for somewhere far away, Mesopotamia or Russia. The labels sometimes literally read water carrier or tank. The workers building them called them tanks. The name was a lie. It was a piece of camouflage, and it was so convenient and so sticky that it simply never went away. We are, all of us to this day, calling these machines by a deliberate piece of First World War misdirection. And I find that delightful. And here's the proof of just how well that lie worked. Because it didn't only fool the Germans, it fooled our own side. Listen to a man who saw the things before anyone was supposed to know what they were. His name was Horace Calvert, an infantryman who served first with the West Yorkshire Regiment and then went out to the Western Front with the Grenadier Guards. Decades on, he recorded for the Imperial War Museum his memory of stumbling across these mysterious shapes by the roadside, hidden under tarpaulin sheets with sentries posted around them. The men asked what they were, and they got a single word back. Now, just a quick note, Horace Calvert, of course, is not Canadian, but it is difficult to find Canadian voices on this subject for some reason. So I have kind of filled in the gaps here a little bit with some British voices. So here is Horace Calvert.
They were on the roadside, covered with tarpaulin sheets. You could see nothing except a square outline. And there was 2 or 3 around it, guarding it. And when we asked what it was, the simple reply was tanks. We naturally assumed water tanks, and with no reason to think otherwise. It was one of the best kept secrets, I think, on that front. Knowing the shortage of water, we thought they were getting reserve supplies to make sure there was adequate supplies. And that was accepted by all, I believe.
Water tanks. Of course. There was a chronic shortage of clean water at the front, so a reserve supply made perfect, boring, unremarkable sense. And the men slept a few yards from the most secret weapon of the war and never gave it a second look. The lie was so ordinary that it became invisible. That right there is how you hide a 30-ton monster in plain sight. So picture what they'd actually built by the summer of 1916. The Mark I tank. It weighed in the neighborhood of 28 tons. It came in 2 flavors, and the names are very of their time. The male, armed with a pair of naval 6-pounder guns in side mountings called sponsons, again, that Navy DNA, and machine guns, and the female, armed with machine guns only, meant to sweep away infantry, male and female, hunting in pairs. And the crew, 8 men sealed inside that steel box. And here's where I want to stop the tour, open the hatch, and climb inside with them. Because if the German infantryman's terror is one half of the human story of the tank, the crew's ordeal is the other, and it might be the more astonishing of the two. We tend to imagine the tank as the safe option, the armored one, the men who got to ride while everyone else walked into the guns. The reality is that the inside of a First World War tank was one of the most purely hellish working environments human beings have ever volunteered to enter. Let me try to put you in there. First, the heat. The engine didn't sit in its own compartment the way it would in any sane vehicle. There was no firewall, no bulkhead, nothing. The crew shared the same undivided space as a great roaring petrol engine inches away with no meaningful ventilation. On a working day, the temperature inside could climb to 50 degrees Celsius. That's 122 Fahrenheit. Some accounts put it higher still in the heat of summer action. Men cooked in there. They blacked out at their stations. And here's the cruel twist that comes up again and again in the records. Crews would often collapse the moment they got out. They'd push through the action on adrenaline and willpower, haul themselves into the fresh air, and only then drop because their bodies had been quietly poisoned the whole time. And clean oxygen was the thing that finally toppled them. Because, second, the air. That sealed steel box filled up with a genuinely toxic atmosphere. Carbon monoxide from the engine, raw petrol and oil vapor, and on top of it, the cordite fumes from the guns when they were firing. The ventilation was nowhere near enough to clear it, so the men breathed poison for hours. Carbon monoxide is the sinister one because it doesn't announce itself. You don't feel like you're suffocating. You just get slow and stupid and sick and Crews frequently had no idea how badly they'd been gassed until they were out and vomiting in the mud. Splitting headaches, nausea, men violently ill. That was the baseline working condition, not the disaster, the baseline. Third, the noise. There was no internal communication system, no radio, nothing. And there couldn't have been because the din inside was so total that the human voice simply lost. The engine, the tracks, the guns, all of it hammering inside a metal drum. The commander couldn't give an order by speaking it, so how did 8 men coordinate? They screamed directly into each other's ears. They used hand signals, and when that failed, they hit each other and the hull, a bang of a spanner, a kick, a thump with the fist to get a crewman's attention through the wall of sound. Picture trying to fight a battle, drive a 30-ton machine, and aim naval guns while half poisoned in 50-degree heat and unable to hear the man 2 feet away from you. And if they couldn't talk to each other, they certainly couldn't talk to anyone outside. No radio meant no way to call back to headquarters, no way to coordinate with the tank 100 meters over, or with the infantry trudging behind. So they fell back on methods that sound almost medieval next to the futuristic machine they were riding in. Things like signal flags, lamps, semaphore, borrowed from the Navy kit of ways to wave at each other across a battlefield. And yes, carrier pigeons. I am not joking. These 30-ton mechanical monsters, the cutting edge of 20th century war, went into action carrying birds because a pigeon was genuinely a more reliable way to get a message back than anything else they had. Fourth, your own ride is trying to hurt you. There was no suspension, none. So every shell hole, every tree stump, every lip of every trench threw the machine and the men inside it violently up and down and side to side. And remember what surrounds them. A red-hot engine, sharp metal edges, gun mountings, ammunition. Men were flung against scalding surfaces. They were bruised, burned, cut, concussed, just by the act of moving across the battlefield before the enemy did a single thing to them. And then, fifth, the enemy does do something. And we have to talk about splash or flaking because it's the detail that once you know it, you never quite shake. When German machine gun and rifle fire hit the outside of the tank, and at the moment of attack it came down like hail, constant and drumming, the armor usually stopped the bullet, usually. But stopping the bullet wasn't the same as keeping it out. On impact, the lead core of the round could melt, and that molten metal would find its way inward through the tiniest gaps between the riveted armor plates and in through the vision slits and the pistol ports the crew were trying to see and shoot through. So fine sprays of white-hot metal into a sealed compartment full of men. On the earlier tanks, with their thinner and more brittle armor, a bullet strike could also knock flakes of the inside surface of the plate loose and send them flying. The same effect from the other direction. The crews called all of it with that grim frontline humor, the splash or flaking. It wasn't usually lethal. What it did was pepper your face and hands with tiny burning fragments, and if it caught you in the eye, it could blind you. And that's why those photographs exist, the ones that look like something out of a fever dream. Tank crews in leather helmets and chainmail face masks and steel mesh visors hanging over their eyes like a medieval knights. The gear isn't a costume, it's the bare minimum answer to the flaking. And here's the detail that tells you how relentless the fire could be. There's an account of a tank coming back from Cambrai in 1917 that had been hit so many times that the flaking had scoured the inside of the hull bright, as if someone had painted it silver. Imagine being one of the men inside while that was happening. We don't have to imagine it alone because one of the men who took a tank into action on that very first day left us a recording of what it was like. His name was Reifer, a gunner in one of the original Mark I's at the Somme, Tank D-17, commanded by Lieutenant Hasty. Hold on to that name, we'll meet Hasty himself in a few minutes on the road to Fleurs. Listen to the noise he describes, and then listen to what the flaking did to the man standing on the other side of the tank from him.
I was a gunner in Lieutenant Hasty's tank, and we were going up to the approaches to Fleurs, and there was a terrific amount of noise in the tank, made up by the engine, the tracks, and the tumbling about of the barrels of oil and various things that were in the tank. A terrific noise was going on. The barrage, our own barrage, was going on outside, and the German barrage. We went on up the Fleurs Road, and we were fired on by German machine guns. And first of all, they were firing on the starboard side, and the impact of their bullets was making the inside of the armour plate white hot, and the white hot flakes were coming off, and if you happened to be near enough, we could have been blinded by them. Fortunately, none of us on the starboard side caught it, but there was a gunner Sugden on the port side. He was wounded that way.
There it is. Everything we've just described from a man who was deafened and his buddy half blinded by it. And just a side note, Private A. Reifer was interviewed by the Imperial War Museum and Peter Hart. And now, sixth, and this is the one that genuinely surprises people. Driving the thing was a team sport. A Mark I didn't have a steering wheel that one man turned. Steering it took the coordinated effort of as many as 4 of the crew. The driver and the commander working the brakes, and the main gearbox up front, and 2 more men, the gearsmen, back near the engine, each working a secondary gearbox on one of the tracks, changing the gearing on the left or right track on shouted or signaled command to swing the machine around. Get that even slightly wrong, and remember, these were often barely trained crews, half deafened and half gassed, and you'd overstress the drivetrain and break down, which is a big part of why so many of these machines simply died on the way to the fight. The tank that ditched in a shell hole at Courcelette wasn't always killed by the enemy. Sometimes it was killed by the sheer impossible difficulty of driving it. And you're doing all of this. The heat, the poison, the noise, the flaking, the 4-man driving ballet, half blind, peering out through a narrow vision slit that the bullet flaking is actively trying to come in through in a machine that crawls at a walking pace, which means you are the biggest, slowest, most obvious target on the battlefield. And while the early tanks were proof against ordinary rifle and machine gun fire, the Germans were already working on the answer. Armor-piercing K bullets, and before long, the brutal 13mm anti-tank rifle, and above all, the field gun firing over open sights. Because the thing every tank crew feared most wasn't the flaking, it was the direct hit from a shell. Because the tank was full of petrol and ammunition, and a tank that was hit could burn fast with 8 men trying to get out through small hatches in the dark and the smoke. They had a word for it later in the next war, but the dread was born in this one, being brewed up. So when you hear later in this episode that the tanks at Courcelette broke down in droves, that they ditched and stalled and failed, I want you to hold this picture in your head alongside the disappointment. Every one of those machines that did get forward, that did crush the wire, that did send a German sergeant running and screaming about crocodiles, it did so with 8 men inside it, enduring all of that at once, for hours. The tank terrified the enemy. We should never lose sight of the fact that it also half killed the men who crewed it. It was, in short, a barely controllable, half-blind, deafening, poisonous, breakdown-prone steel oven crawling across the worst terrain on Earth at the speed of a slow walk. Call it 6 kilometers an hour flat out, far less across mud. And in the late summer of 1916, the British High Command had to decide what to do with this strange, unproven, secret thing. The man at the top, Sir Douglas Haig, made a call that historians have argued about ever since. He decided to use them. Now, in the middle of the Somme, before there were many of them, before the crews were fully trained, before the doctrine had been worked out, before, by the cautious view, they were ready. and the place he chose to send them was a sector of the Somme front anchored on a wrecked village where the Canadian Corps was about to launch one of its hardest assaults of the entire war, Courcelette.
We were one of the first brigades ever to see a tank, I think, and everybody was staggered to see this extraordinary monster crawling over the ground. But when it came to the first use of them, we had a terrible disappointment because they failed completely.
Let's set the scene properly because this is our ground. This is the Canadian Corps' fight, and it deserves the detail. By September of 1916, the Canadians had been pulled south into the Somme meat grinder. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette, that's the formal name for the phase of the Somme that opens on the 15th of September, is the one where the tanks debut. And the Canadian objective on the left of the assault is the village of Courcelette itself, along with a strong point just south of it that the men called the sugar factory. It was a fortified refinery the Germans had turned into a nest of machine guns and concrete. This is the assault that the 2nd Canadian Division goes in on. And the Canadian Corps front is allotted a small number of these new machines to support the attack. A handful, around half a dozen, with a clutch of them detailed to push along Sugar Trench and deal with the machine guns dug into the sugar factory and Courcelette itself. Now, a word about the bigger picture. For the battle as a whole, the British committed 49 tanks, which astonishingly was every Mark I they had been able to get to the front. That was the entire armoured strength of the British Army scraped together and thrown in. But committed and in action are two very different things, and this is the heartbreak of the tank's debut. They broke down on the way to the start line. They ditched in shell holes and couldn't climb out. They threw tracks, they cooked their engines, their green crews fumbled them into the mud. Of those 49, fewer than half actually got into the fight at all. The figures the historians give bounce around between roughly 15 and 30, depending on how you count in action. And only about 9 surmounted every obstacle and pushed on ahead of the infantry into the German positions. 9 out of an army's entire tank force.
One broke down before it reached the front line. One broke down in the front line. Only one got across the front line, broke down before it reached the German front line. So they were a complete failure. But just to the north of us, a tank had a great success at a place called Flers.
So if you're scoring the tank's first day on a pure success and failure basis, it's a disappointment. That's the honest verdict, and it's the one Nicholson and Cook would both have you reach for. Too few, too fragile, too soon. A weapon committed before it was ripe, scattered in penny packets across a wide front rather than massed where it could be decisive. But a tally of breakdowns and ditched machines is a cold way to measure a day like that. And before we leave that verdict behind, I want to put a human voice in the room, somebody who was actually on that front when the things first crawled into the world. Thomas Brown was a signaller with the King's Liverpool Regiment, and like every other man out there, he had never in all his life seen anything remotely like what came clanking out of the British lines that September. So here he is, describing the tanks.
They were very cumbersome things at first, terrific caterpillar wheels, and what they were very good, of course, that they were able to get across the trench, without, and they'd crush the wires, They did work that the artillery couldn't do. Very often our men attacked the German front line and found the wire hadn't been cut by our own artillery. But as soon as the tanks came along, of course, they simply crushed the wires, And even his machine guns, because the infantry used to follow just behind the tank. There was usually a little party of infantrymen following the tank. But I think they frightened the life out of Jerry when he first saw them.
Now, something happened that first day that the numbers don't capture, And it's the thing that kept the whole tank program alive. The tanks terrified the Germans. And I want to slow right down here because this is the heart of the whole debut. And it's the part the casualty returns and the breakdown reports can't capture. I want to do something we don't often get to do on this show. I want to turn the camera around. We've spent this whole episode so far on the British and the Canadian side of the wire. The inventors with their land ships, the engineers with their levers, and the generals doing their cold arithmetic about when to gamble. But the tank's debut isn't really a story about machinery. It's a story about fear. And the people best placed to tell us what a tank actually was on that first morning aren't the men who built it. They're the men on the receiving end. So come back across no man's land with me one more time, into those German trenches around Courcelette and Flers, and let's stand in the boots of an ordinary German soldier just before dawn on the 15th of September, 1916. Here's what his world is. He's been on the Somme for weeks, maybe months, and the Somme has taught him a particular kind of fear, the fear of the shell. It's a vast, impersonal, random terror that falls from the sky, and he has made some kind of peace with it the way men do because he has to. He knows the British will come walking across the open soon, and he knows what his machine guns will do to them when they do, because that's the iron logic of this battlefield, and it's held for 2 years. He's afraid, but it's a familiar fear. He understands the rules. Now, strip his vision down. There's fog in the Somme Valley that morning, thick autumn fog, and smoke on top of it, so he can barely see the far lip of no man's land. And out of that fog comes a sound he has never heard in his life. Not a whistle, not a crack, but a deep mechanical grinding and clattering, getting louder, getting closer, slow and patient and utterly wrong. And then a shape resolves out of the murk, something enormous, something that should not be able to move, moving, heaving itself up, dipping down over broken ground, swallowing the barbed wire, coming straight at him and shrugging off the bullets he and his comrades are pouring into it as if they were nothing at all. There is no rule for this. Nothing in 2 years of war has prepared him for it, and this is the specific, particular quality of the terror at Courcelette, and it's worth naming precisely. It isn't the fear of being killed. He lives with that every hour. It's the deeper, more primitive horror of the category error. The thing in front of him does not fit into any box his mind has for the world. It's too big, too slow, too invulnerable, too alive. And the human animal, confronted with something it cannot categorize and cannot stop, reaches back past all its training to something much older. I think I'm having an anxiety attack just thinking about this, which brings us to the single best attested German reaction of that whole morning. And it's the one I most wanted to get to you. There was a German sergeant, a Feldwebel named Weinert, serving with the 211th Regiment, who left an account of what happened in his sector. And he describes a comrade who simply broke. The man came running back from the forward line, out of his mind with terror, shouting a warning to anyone who'd listen. And the warning was this: there is a crocodile crawling into our lines. A crocodile. Hang on to that for a second in your head because it tells you everything. This was a grown man, a trained soldier of one of the finest armies on earth, and when his mind reached for something, anything, to explain the steel monster heaving and dipping toward him through the fog, the closest thing it could find was a giant reptile, a prehistoric predator. Weinert says the poor wretch had quite simply lost his head, that he saw the machine rearing up and plunging down as it came on, and his brain rendered it as a living beast. And he wasn't alone in reaching for the language of monsters. Another German soldier remembered the tank simply as unearthly things, monsters that spat death, looming up out of the dawn. The men who faced them that morning again and again do not describe machines. They describe creatures, and that's the tell. That's the thing the numbers can never show you. For a few minutes on a strip of Picardy mud, the most modern weapon ever built reached so far past the experience of the men in front of it that it stopped being a machine in their minds and became a dragon. Now, and this is where we have to hold the line on honesty, because it would be very easy to oversell this. And I have to give you the other half, because the historians who passed down the crocodile story are also the first to wave a yellow flag over it. The accounts of German panic at Courcelette are, in their own careful words, possibly exaggerated. And here's the crucial corrective. Most of the German army that morning did not break. They did not run. As you'd expect of that army, the great majority stood, recovered from the shock, and within days, the inevitable, methodical German counterattacks came rolling back in and clawed back much of the ground. The terror was real. I don't think there's any doubt that it was real, for some men in some places for a while. But it was local and it was temporary, and a hardened army shook it off faster than the legend would like. Both things are true at once, and I'd rather hand you both than tidy it into a monster story. But here's why even the temporary terror matters so enormously. Why it's the thing that kept the whole tank program alive, because the tank, even broken, had demonstrated something that 2 years of bloodshed seemed to deny. That the problem of crossing no man's land, that blood-soaked, insoluble problem we opened with, was not insoluble after all. You just had to bring the right machine in the right numbers, in the right way, and the man behind the machine gun would, at least for a moment, reach for the word crocodile and run. Nobody had the second two parts of that figured out yet. The numbers and the doctrine were years of failure away, but Courcelette proved the first part. The concept worked. The dragon was real. And the village itself? The Canadians took it. The 2nd Division, with the tanks where they could keep up, and on their own where they couldn't, fought through the sugar factory and into Courcelette, and the fighting around there over the following days was some of the most savage of the entire Somme. This is the same patch of hell where the very next day, the 16th of September 1916, a private of the 49th Battalion named John Chipman Kerr would do the thing that earned him the Victoria Cross at a bombing block in the trenches near the village. I bring Chip Kerr up deliberately, and not just because we've spent a whole episode with him a couple of weeks ago. I bring him up because it's the perfect illustration of what the tank actually was in 1916 and what it wasn't. The tank debuted on the 15th. It made its noise, it spread its terror, it broke down in droves. And then on the 16th, the work of clearing those trenches, of holding that block, of winning that ground at close quarters with bomb and bayonet, was done by a man on foot, by Kerr and men like him. The machine had arrived, but in 1916, the war was still being won and lost, one infantryman at a time. That tension is the whole story of the tank on the Western Front, really. A new machine that promised to take the killing off the backs of the infantry, arriving slowly, painfully, a fraction of a step at a time, while the infantry kept right on bleeding. There's one more thing from the debut worth your attention because it's become almost legend. As the fighting swept the village of Flers on the right of the battlefield, a Royal Flying Corps observer flying overhead sent back a report that got into newspapers and electrified the public at home. A tank, he said, was walking down the high street of Flers with the British Army cheering along behind it. And the tank he was watching has a name and a commander we can put to it. It was D-17, a mail tank, number 795, with a name daubed on its flank in broad Scots, Diniken, which is about as much to say, I don't know, or don't ask me, in Scottish. My grandma used to say it all the time. Grandma, what time is supper ready? At Diniken. And we don't have to take the airman's word for any of it because the man who commanded Diniken lived to tell the story himself. His name was Lieutenant Stuart Hasty, a Scot, an Edinburgh man, 27 years old that morning, and he'd be awarded the Military Cross for what he did over the next few hours. The citation noting in that bone-dry way that he fought his tank with great gallantry and reached the third objective. He's the commander of the very tank our gunner Reifer rode in, the D-17 whose flaking we stood inside back a couple of paragraphs ago. Hasty crushed the German wire, put his tank across the trench and raked the defenders, then drove on into Flers itself. Years later, he recorded his memory of the approach, the road down into the village shelled into ruin, the Flers ahead of him clouded in the smoke of the British barrage.
Having crossed the front German line, I could see the old road down into Flers, which was in a shocking condition, having been shelled by both sides since the 1st of July, I imagine. And at the other end of this road, which about a mile away from where I could see, and I could see the village of Flers, clouded with smoke from the barrage which had come down on the top of it. And across the front of the village, there was a trench which was eventually named Flers Trench. And this formed the barricade in front of the village on the British side. When we got down to Flers Trench and passing into the village, there was a great deal of activity from the eaves under the roofs of the cottages, and also from a trench which appeared to be further through the village. But certainly the Germans were running from Flers Trench and were pretty well evacuating that all the time. In fact, they came out in ones and twos after that while we were still there.
Flers fell that day, a village that earlier attempts had failed to take at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, and it fell in part because of a machine that the men inside it could barely steer, breathe in, or hear themselves think in. So hang on to that thought as one. The triumph up the high street and the ordeal of the 8 men sealed inside the thing that made it possible. Haig certainly thought so. Whatever the critics said about throwing the tanks away too early, and Swinton, who'd wanted them held back and used in one great mass surprise, was bitterly disappointed. Haig came out of Courcelette wanting more tanks, hundreds more. The disappointment of the debut, paradoxically, became the seed of the whole armored future. But first, the tank had to survive 1917, and 1917 very nearly killed it. So let's talk about the awkward adolescence of the tank, because 1917 is where the dream and the mud have it out. The machines themselves got a little better. The Mark IV, which becomes the workhorse of 1917, is a refinement of the Mark I. Better armor against that horrible bullet flaking, more reliable, improved sponsons that could be pushed in for transport. But the fundamental problems hadn't gone away. It was still slow, still blind, and still mechanically fragile, still a furnace inside. And crucially, the thinking about how to use them was still only half formed. You'd get attacks where tanks were committed in small numbers across ground that simply wasn't suitable, with infantry that hadn't trained alongside them against defenses that were starting to adapt. The Germans were learning. They began to dig trenches wider, too wide for a tank to span. They sighted field guns for direct fire at the machines because a tank that could shrug off a rifle bullet could be brewed up in an instant by a shell. They brought in armor-piercing K bullets that could punch through the early tank's thin plate, and they were already working toward the purpose-built anti-tank rifle that would arrive the following year. So the tank's brief reign of pure terror was already being challenged. And then there was the mud. We have to talk about the mud, because 1917 on the Western Front means, above all, one name: Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres. Months of fighting through low-lying, waterlogged Flanders landscape churned by years of shell fire and then drenched by relentless rain until the battlefield became an honest-to-God swamp, a place where wounded men drowned in the shell holes and where the ground itself was the enemy. This is no exaggeration. So for the tank, Passchendaele was a catastrophe. These 30-ton machines simply sank. They bellied down in the bottomless mud and stopped. Useless, marooned, sometimes with their crews trapped inside under fire. Photographs of tanks half swallowed by the Flanders ooze became, in a grim way, the emblem of the whole battle. And if you wanted to design a place to humiliate the tank, you could hardly do better than Passchendaele. The lesson, written in mud and blood, was that this machine needed ground, firm ground, dry ground it could actually cross. Use it in a swamp and you've thrown it away. Which brings us to the 20th of November, 1917, and to a place called Cambrai, and to the moment when, for the first time, somebody put all the pieces together. Cambrai is the great experiment. Somebody finally said, let's take everything we've learned and do the opposite of every mistake. Let's choose ground that suits the tank, the firm, rolling chalk downland in front of Cambrai, not a swamp. Let's mass the tanks. Not a handful scattered along a wide front, but the largest concentration anyone had ever assembled, hundreds of them, hitting on a relatively narrow frontage. Let's add surprise. No long preliminary bombardment to warn the enemy and chew up the ground, but a sudden hurricane barrage and the tanks rolling forward out of nowhere. And let's send them against the Hindenburg Line, the most formidable defense system the Germans had built. The number of tanks gathered for Cambrai was 476, the entire strength of the tank corps, of which something like 378 were fighting machines and the rest carried supplies and stores. And on that first morning, it worked spectacularly in a way nothing had worked before. The tanks crushed the wire, crossed the trenches, some of them carrying great bundles of brushwood to drop into wide German trenches and bridge them, and tore a hole several kilometers deep into the Hindenburg Line in a matter of hours. A line that had cost rivers of blood everywhere simply opened. The news hit Britain like a thunderclap. For the first time in the entire war, the church bells of Britain were rung in celebration of a victory. After 3 years of casualtyless and stalemate, the bells rang. And then, and this is so very First World War, it came apart. The breakthrough wasn't exploited in time. There weren't enough fresh reserves to pour through the gap before the Germans could react, and react they did with a powerful, well-organized counterattack at the end of November that won back much of the lost ground. The bells, in retrospect, had rung early. Cambrai ended as something close to a draw on the map. But on the map is the wrong place to measure Cambrai. Measure it as a proof of concept, and it's one of the most important days in the history of warfare. Cambrai proved the doctrine. Right ground, mass, surprise, tanks and infantry and artillery working as one. Everything the tanks advocates had argued for demonstrated in a single morning. The failure to hold the gains was a failure of everything around the tanks, so reserves, communications, the sheer difficulty of exploitation, not of the idea itself. I'll note for our purposes that Canadians were in the Cambrai story too, though not in the tanks. The Canadian Cavalry Brigade was committed in the exploitation phase in that desperate, doomed effort to turn the breach into a breakthrough, and the cavalry's experience there is a hard lesson in the limits of the horse against the machine gun, even in 1917. So here's where we stand as 1917 turns into 1918. The tank has been humiliated in the mud and vindicated on the chalk. The lesson is learned, the doctrine is proven. The advocates know exactly what the machine can do if it's used properly. What they need now is the chance to do it at scale and a moment in the war where it matters. The moment is coming, and when it comes, the spearhead is going to be Canadian. So everything in this episode has been building to a field east of Amiens on the 8th of August, 1918. So let me set up why this day matters so enormously, not just for the tank, but for the war. By the summer of 1918, the strategic picture had swung hard. The Germans had gambled everything on a series of massive spring offensives. The last throw, using divisions freed up from the Eastern Front after Russia collapsed, racing to win before the full weight of the United States arrived. Remember again, the United States arrived to help out in late spring 1918. The offensives gained ground, frightening amounts of ground, but they bled the German army white and they failed to land a knockout. And by August, the initiative had passed to the Allies. Now it was the Allies' turn to attack, and this time they had the tank and they had learned how to use it. The plan for Amiens was Cambrai lesson applied with ruthless professionalism, and at the heart of it were two formations that had become, by 1918, genuinely elite shock troops. The Australian Corps under Monash and the Canadian Corps under Sir Arthur Currie. These were the formations you put at the point of the spear when you absolutely needed to break the line. And the secrecy around moving the Canadian Corps into position was extraordinary. An elaborate deception to convince the Germans that the Canadians were going into the line up at Ypres, miles away, while in fact they were being slipped quietly into the assault sector at Amiens. The whole thing was a masterpiece of surprise. And the tanks. This was the largest concentration of armor the war had yet seen. More than 500, all told. Over 400 of them fighting machines with the rest carrying supplies and ammunition forward. And these weren't the lumbering Mark I's of Courcelette. The British had the Mark V now. Better, faster, and drivable by one man instead of a sweating four-man committee. A real improvement. They had the medium Mark A Whippet, a lighter, faster machine twice the speed of the heavies, designed to do the thing the war had never managed, to break through and then exploit, to gallop into the enemy's rear like cavalry, but armored. And, keep this one in mind because it matters in a moment, they had the Mark V Star, a lengthened version built with a compartment that could carry a small party of infantry forward through the killing ground and decant them on the objective. The Canadian and Australian Corps were each handed a brigade of these machines. The 4th Canadian Division alone was led forward by 30 of the infantry-carrying stars. This reminds me kind of like a Trojan horse kind of a concept. So on the morning of the 8th of August, in fog and at dawn, with no preliminary bombardment to warn anyone, the whole thing came down on the Germans at once. A sudden hurricane of artillery firing a creeping barrage, the infantry of the Canadian and Australian Corps advancing close behind it, and the tanks rolling forward out of the mist. Combined arms, everything together, everything coordinated, everything aimed at the same place at the same moment. And the German line broke. Not cracked, broke. The Canadian Corps advanced on that first day distances that simply did not happen on the Western Front. Around 13 kilometers, 8 miles, in a single day. Gains that in 1916 would have taken months and tens of thousands of lives. The tanks crushed the strong points. The infantry just flowed through. The Whippets ran amok in the German rear. And there's one Whippet story I have to tell you because it's the single best illustration of what these little fast tanks were actually for. A Whippet named Musical Box. They all had names. Commanded by Lieutenant Clement Arnold, with just a driver and a gunner for a crew, broke clean through and spent something like 10 hours roaming behind the German lines, all on its own, unsupported, miles deep, shooting up transport, scattering columns of infantry, knocking out a gun battery that was holding up the advance. The crew were half poisoned by fumes the whole time. They had to clamp respirator mouthpieces between their teeth just to keep breathing. And in the end, German shell fire set the spare petrol tins on the roof ablaze and the machine was finished. The crew bailed out into a crowd of furious German soldiers. The driver was shot and killed, and Arnold and his gunner were beaten and taken prisoner. One small steel machine, alone, deep in the enemy's backyard, doing exactly what every general since the start of the war had dreamed of, turning a break-in into a breakthrough. But a Whippet running wild in the German rear is the dramatic version of why Amiens worked. The quieter and frankly more important version was happening right at the point of the spear, in the way the infantry and the tanks had at long last learned to fight as a single thing. And for that, I'm not going to give you my narration. I'm going to give you a man who was actually there. And his name was James Neil MacLeod, and he recorded his memories for Veterans Affairs Canada's Heroes Remember project. He was a Quebec boy. He'd left school and enlisted at Sherbrooke in December of 1915, still only 16 years old, with the 117th Battalion, and gone overseas to join the 24th Battalion, the Victoria Rifles of Canada, part of the 2nd Division. By the time he stood at Amiens in August 1918, he was a hardened veteran of Vimy, the Somme, and Arras, and he'd be wounded in the elbow just weeks after this, near the end of August. He went forward with the tanks on the 8th of August. In under a minute of recording, he gives us 2 gifts. First, he confirms from the inside all that business about steering that we talked about a little bit earlier. Second, the earliest tanks dragged a wheeled tail along behind them to help them turn. The Germans learned to shoot it away, and the crews ended up steering by the tracks alone, exactly as we described. And then he tells us in plain, unhurried words how the Canadians actually used these machines on the 8th of August. Listen to this.
Another thing in the Battle of Amiens that it's the first time that we ever saw our tanks in action. They had come in the Battle of the Somme, but I remember they had made the troops so clumsy and one thing that they couldn't use them there. The Germans used to shoot the steering apparatus off. And they had one wheel behind arrangement to steer by. And they changed that and just steered by the track. So on the Battle of Amiens, so many of each company were detailed to 6 men, I think it was, from each company went into that particular tank and traveled with the tank, so that when they reached their objective, these infantrymen would leave the tank and hold the line until the rest of us got out. This was a system that was used in the Battle of Amiens to considerable success too. It proved to the authorities that actually the tanks were feasible. They improved considerable in World War II, but that type of tank had the track all around. He watched them firing. They had 6-pounder guns on each turret, on each right. They had a turret on the side of the tank where they fired the 6-pounder gun and the machine guns in the front. It was quite effective when they got up close to the machine gun, because the machine gun bullets didn't have any effect on them.
Unfortunately, it was a little difficult to hear everything he said because the Veterans Affairs original producers had added those tank sound effects. But basically, did you catch what he laid out for us? Because that, in the words of a man who rode in the tank, is combined arms. That's basically what he was saying, and it's the whole answer to the riddle we opened the episode with. Think back to what I said at the beginning of the episode. There was the impossible problem, the one that killed men by the 100,000. How do you cross a few hundred meters of fire-swept ground, get through, and then actually hold what you've taken? MacLeod just described the solution clicking into place. The tank does the first part. It carries the men across the killing ground that would have scythed them down on foot, crushes the wire and the strong points, and delivers them to the objective alive. And then the infantry do the part the tank can never do. They get out, they dig in, and they hold the line until the rest of us got up. The machine gets you there. The man keeps you there. Neither one wins alone. Together, they break the Western Front. And I love the texture of how he said it, that offhand, 6 men, I think it was. The memory worn smooth by decades, the modesty of a man describing something genuinely historic, as if it were a sensible bit of office procedure. He's describing the Mark V Star tanks we met a moment ago, the lengthened machines built to carry an infantry party forward like a Trojan horse and set it down on the objective, which is exactly the job he's recounting. The Canadian Corps was handed a brigade for them at Amiens. And note his verdict, delivered with that same Canadian understatement. It worked, he says, to considerable success, too. That's the sound of deadlock breaking, not in a general's memoir, but it's in the plain recollection of a private from the Victoria Rifles. Now here's the line you've probably heard, the one that tells you what the 8th of August meant. The German commander Erich Ludendorff later called it the Black Day of the German Army. And he didn't mean it as a tactical observation about a few lost kilometers. He meant something deeper and more frightening from the German point of view. He meant that on that day, for the first time, large numbers of German soldiers, Good soldiers, veteran soldiers, had simply given up. They surrendered in droves, stopped believing they could win. The Black Day wasn't about the ground, it was about morale. It was the day the German army's will began to break. And the tank really was central to that, not because it won the battle by itself, I'll be very firm about that in a moment, but because the combined arms attack that the tank made possible, the sudden overwhelming shock at Amiens, was the thing that finally cracked an army's confidence. Amiens opens what we now call the 100 Days, the 100 Days Offensive, the final hammering Allied offensive that runs from August right through to the armistice on the 11th of November. And the Canadian Corps spends those 100 days as one of the spearhead formations of the entire British effort, battle after battle with the tanks alongside them, fighting the open warfare that everyone had been praying for since 1914. Because remember, within a month or two of the war beginning back in 1914, the war had stopped moving. It was a stalemate, so finally, things have opened up. Tim Cook's book called Shock Troops is the place to live in this period if you want the Canadian texture of it, the cost of being the spearhead, the brilliance, and the bleeding of the 100 days, the way the Canadian Corps became a weapon the High Command reached for again and again, precisely because it could break lines that others couldn't. The tank is woven all through that story. It's not the whole story. But by August of 1918, you genuinely cannot tell the story of how the Western Front was finally cracked open without it. So I highly recommend checking out that book. Let me pull on the Canadian thread a little more directly because I think there's a lovely "did you know" buried in there, and I love that kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing that makes, listeners feel like insiders. Here's the irony. Canadians were there at the tank's debut at Courcelette, and the Canadians were the spearhead at the tank's apotheosis at Amiens. And yet, through almost the entire war, Canadians fought alongside the tanks rather than in them. The tanks supporting the Canadian Corps were British machines, crewed by British soldiers, of what started as the heavy section of the machine gun corps and became the tank corps. The infantry doing the close work, the men who took Courcelette and broke the line at Amiens, those were the Canadians. But Canada did move late toward fielding its own armor. In 1918, the government raised Canadian tank battalions, recruiting heavily from university students in Toronto and Montreal, and sent them to England to the Imperial Tank Training Camp at Bovington in Dorset to learn the machine on Mark V's. And here's the "did you know?" By the time they were ready, the war was essentially over. The 1st Canadian Tank Battalion was on the very point of leaving for France when the armistice was signed. Canadian Tank Corps was formally authorized 2 days after the guns fell silent. Canada's own tankers never fired a shot as a Canadian armored unit in the First World War. It's one of those poignant near misses of history. Canada at the very birth of the tank, Canada at the tank's triumph, and Canada's own tankers arriving at the table just as the meal was being cleared away. There's a human angle here too. For the Canadian infantryman, the tank was this strange, ambivalent thing. On one hand, when a tank was working and rolling forward beside you, crushing wire and silencing the machine gun that would otherwise have killed you, it was salvation, it was a miracle, and you loved it. On the other hand, a tank was a magnet. It drew every German gun for hundreds of meters. Walk too close to a tank, and you walked into the beaten zone of every artillery piece and anti-tank rifle that wanted to kill it. The relationship between the infantry and the tank was complicated, affectionate, and wary at the same time. And that ambivalence is, I think, a much truer picture than the simple wonder weapon story. So let me bring us home with the question everyone wants answered, the one that gets asked about every new weapon. Did the tank win the war? The honest historian's answer, the Nicholson answer, the Cook answer, the answer I'd want you to land on is no, not by itself. No single weapon won that war, and you should be deeply suspicious of anyone who tells you otherwise, whether they're selling you the tank or the machine gun or the airplane or artillery. The First World War was won the way it was fought, by enormous, grinding, combined effort, by the artillery above all, by the infantry that did the overwhelming share of the dying, by the logistics and blockade and manpower and the slow exhaustion of an entire continent. But here's the more interesting answer, the one that sits in the tension you like to hold rather than collapsing it into something tidy. The tank didn't win the war, but the tank, together with the airplane, the wireless, the perfected artillery, all of it knitted into one coordinated system, the tank was a crucial part of how the deadlock was finally broken. It was the key piece of the answer to that impossible problem we started with. How do you cross fire-swept ground and live? In 1914, there was no answer, and men died by the 100,000 for the lack of one. But by 1918, at Amiens, there was an answer, and the tank was a central part of it. And the deeper legacy is the one that outlived the war entirely. Everyone who really understood what happened at Cambrai and Amiens, and there were thinking soldiers in every army taking notes, understood that they just watched the future arrive. The combination of armor and mobility and combined arms that broke the German line in 1918 is the direct ancestor of the Blitzkrieg that would tear across the same fields just 22 years later. The men in those chainmail masks, vomiting in their 50-degree steel ovens, half blind, communicating by pigeon, they were the awkward, suffering, pioneer grandparents of every armored force on Earth today. So I want to leave you back where we started. The German infantryman in the grey dawn at Courcelette, hearing a sound he's never heard before, watching a steel monster ignore his fire. He's at the hinge of history, and he doesn't know it. He just knows that the rules of his world have suddenly, terrifyingly changed. And a few hundred meters away on the Canadian Corps front, men of the 2nd and 3rd Divisions are going forward in and around Courcelette, some of them keeping pace with these strange new machines, most of them on their own 2 feet. The next morning in those same trenches, a homesteader from a farm out west named Chip Kerr is going to do something extraordinary with nothing but a rifle, a few bombs, and an almost unimaginable amount of nerve. The machine had arrived, but the man still had to win the ground. And that's the tank on the Western Front. A desperate idea, a clanking failure, a hard-won triumph, and woven right through it from the first hour to the last, the Canadian Corps. Thank you again for taking the time to march through the mud with me. This has been Memory and Valor. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae, and I thank you again for spending the time, taking the time out to listen to this podcast, whether you're doing dishes, going on a road trip, or just getting things done and wanted a little company in your ear. I'm always here for that. So again, if you want to support the show, you can do so at memoryandvalor.ca or on buymeacoffee.com and search up Memory and Valor, where you'll have the option to buy me a coffee. Any kind of coffee is great. So until next time, keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.